This is Wednesday, January 5, 2022. Welcome to the League of Women Voters annual Legislators Send-Off meeting. We're delighted you've joined us this evening. A few items of housekeeping. This meeting is being recorded and will be uploaded onto our website and our Facebook channel, our YouTube channel, excuse me. Everyone is asked to mute their microphone at this time and remain so throughout the meeting. Feel free to type your questions into the chat feature for our panelists. Our off-screen monitor, Susan Pipes, will ensure that your questions are relayed to our moderator for this evening. A few timelines for us. We will begin the program with league-generated questions, which will be asked by our moderator to the panelists, and that will go until about 7:40 or 7:45. Thereafter, we will take audience questions typed into the chat feature. Again, our moderator will ask each question of our panelists, and that'll run us till about 8:10. We intend to conclude at that time. I have a few things for your calendar if you would like to take out a pencil at this time. The League of Women Voters of Huntington, West Virginia has created a wonderful video entitled How to Run for Public Office in 2022. It was a workshop video. This video can be found on our website, and a link will appear now in the chat feature. I think Susan is putting it up there. If you want to capture it, you'll be able to watch that video. It's really good. This March, the League of Women Voters of Jefferson County will host a wrap-up meeting with our state legislators, but you'll need to check our Facebook and website postings for date and time updates because it hasn't yet been scheduled, but it is the follow-up to this evening's meeting, so you'll want to be sure to join. I wanted to give you a little bit of history, a background about tonight's event. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization. We neither support nor oppose any political candidate or party. Rather, the League focuses on voter education and gaining a wide base of support for its positions on governmental matters. In this vein, the League of Women Voters of Jefferson County has for years hosted 2 regular meetings with our legislative delegation. The first, like tonight, occurs just before the legislative session, and the purpose is to let our legislators know which issues are important to us as they travel to Charleston to do the people's work. The second meeting occurs just after the legislative session in spring. At that time, we gather again for the legislators to tell us what they accomplished during the session. This evening, we're pleased to have the following delegates and state senators with us. Delegate Wayne Clark represents the 65th Delegate District, covering the greater Charlestown and Ransom areas. We also have Delegate Paul Espinosa. Delegate Espinosa covers the 66th Delegate District, which runs on the southern and western end of Jefferson County, including Middleway and Ripon. And we also have Delegate John Doyle. John Doyle represents the 67th Delegate District and runs to the northern and eastern portions of the county, including Shepherdstown and Bolivar. We also have State Senator Hannah Geffert. She represents the 16th Senatorial District, covering all portions of Jefferson County and portions of Berkeley County, including Martinsburg. Our moderator for this evening is Dixie Dunn. Dixie is a dedicated and active member of the League of Women Voters of Jefferson County and has served as moderator during these past few years of virtual programming, and we appreciate her work in this matter. At this point, I will turn this over to Dixie. Thank you, Dixie, take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And we're pleased to have our delegates with us today. And this would be to both of you, Delegate Clark and Delegate Espinosa. There seems to be a little bit of confusion about what the state legislature has done about voting across party lines. Is it true that an independent may no longer vote either Republican or Democratic ballot in the primary?
I'm not aware of any change whatsoever in that, Dixie. During this last legislative session, the legislature, I don't think, took up any legislation with regard to voting in West Virginia. So I think it's just as it was during the last election cycle.
Okay, well, there's, like I said, there seemed to be some, misunderstanding that, like I said, that voting independently, that you couldn't request a particular ballot when it actually, came to the primary. So that was one of the questions that had come up. And I guess another question that has come up is, how involved will you be in prioritizing the money allocated to the state through the CARES Act?
Well, Delegate Clark, I'll be happy to start if you like. I do serve on the House Finance Committee, and kind of runs together here a little bit, but I think it was during this last legislative session, during the regular session, we did enact, the legislature did enact, and the governor did sign legislation that made it very clear that the legislature does have a important role in appropriating dollars that are received from the federal government. One of the things that we wanted to be very careful when we were enacting that legislation is not to slow state response in cases of emergencies. As I think everybody here on this Zoom call is aware, West Virginia unfortunately has had to face a number of natural disasters, flooding in particular. And so one of the things we wanted to be very careful of is to not tie the hands of the chief executive so much that he or she can't respond to a true emergency. And so I believe, I'm not mistaken, and I might be off on the numbers here a little bit, Dixie, but I think maybe the first $150 million I think can be appropriated by the governor, but then anything above and beyond that needs to be appropriated. Now, there are federal dollars that are going that were appropriated by Congress to go directly to particular entities. So, for example, I believe some of the dollars may have flowed directly to higher education institutions, as I recall, but other monies, I'd say the lion's share of dollars have been appropriated by the legislature. I was actually certainly honored to serve as chief lead sponsor of a piece of legislation we enacted during the last regular session that appropriated, I think it was over $900 million to public education in West Virginia. And of course, that was predominantly CARES Act monies. And again, we certainly have been working very cooperatively with the Senate and with the governor, but we did pass that legislation to make it very clear that those dollars rightly should be appropriated by the state legislature. Wayne, did I cover that?
Yeah, Paul, I think you hit all the points. I just left the Berkeley County Board of Education meeting, and one of the great things that came about in regards to the $900 million that we appropriated was they were able to use it to almost cover 800 individual salaries that weren't covered through the normal funding formula. So the CARES money has definitely helped in keeping our teachers and our service personnel for our education departments, both in Jefferson and Berkeley County, employed.
Okay, that is great. There's another question as we get a little bit further on about the monies appropriated for the teachers. But, well, in fact, it's the next one. It says increased teacher pay and decent broadband are two of the primary needs that West Virginia will never be able to move forward without. Do you plan to fight for an increase in teacher pay and to make sure that the positive sounds that we have heard as far as broadband don't fizzle out and come to naught? So,
Well, certainly appreciate some of the skepticism there, because certainly West Virginia for years has suffered in really having usable broadband in many areas of our state, including here in Jefferson County. I will say that there is broad bipartisan support for funding those two areas, and we actually, I think, allocated the first portion of, I believe there were some CARE Act dollars, but there might have been some ARPA there as well. We enacted some of the first or appropriate some of the first dollars during the regular session, or maybe it might have been during one of the special sessions that followed. And again, the governor, I think, has committed, and again, broad bipartisan support for dedicating probably somewhere in the range of $1 billion to try to address broadband in our state. with regard to our state employee pay, of course, here over the last just few years under our current leadership, we did enact two of the largest pay raises in state history without a tax increase. And when we first started seeing some of the budget, what will likely be budget surpluses, I think we're probably on track to have probably in excess of $700 million budget surplus this year, because revenues are continuing to outpace budget projections. When we first started seeing those first very positive months in this fiscal year that continued on, what was a considerable surplus last year, our leadership team, working with the governor, started discussing, what can we do to, try to build upon the enhancements we've made to public employee salaries. And so we reached out to, I know, our members in our Republican caucus, and there was very strong support there among our 78 members in the House. And I understand the same from the Senate for enacting the 5% aggregate pay raise for our teachers, school service personnel, and other state employees. So certainly anticipate that both of those measures will, the 5% aggregate pay raise, I feel very confident that will win passage. And again, there's already been significant dollars appropriated for broadband, and it's just really a start of what, again, promises to be probably somewhere approaching $1 billion in funding to help expand broadband in West Virginia.
Okay. Delegate Doyle, do you want to comment, or did you hear the question? I know you joined us late.
No, and I apologize for being late. This is my 5th Zoom meeting today, and I had to squeeze in dinner between 6:45 and now. So
okay. That's not allowed. That's not allowed. No, we truly appreciate you persevering and joining us. But what we were talking about was that the increased teacher pay and decent broadband were two of the primary needs of West Virginia. And of course, Delegate Espinosa was commenting on that. Do you have anything that you want to add? I guess one of the other questions along this same line is, will the proposed increase, I know Delegate Espinosa mentioned specifically teachers, but I mean, as far as the pay raises go, does that go for all state employees across the board, regardless of if they're the school janitor or the principal or whatever? So
not just school employees, corrections officers, troopers, human service caseworkers, you name it. It better go to everybody.
Okay.
And I actually personally think we ought to be able to get it higher.
Okay.
Maybe up to as much as 7%. Now, one thing that's important to remember, we do have a very high surplus, but part of that is creative budgeting a year ago, and there's nothing wrong with that. When I was vice chair of the Finance Committee and Deputy Secretary of Revenue, we tried to do that as well, because it's much better to be confronted with more of a surplus than you expected than to be confronted all of a sudden with a deficit that you had not expected, and then you have to go cut and paste and cut various agencies of state government. So, but a surplus is one-time money by definition. That can go to something like expanded high-speed internet, but it can't go for salaries. So I'm going to I'll accept that I'm perhaps contradicting myself here. I would like to see that pay raise get as high as 7%. But I want to make sure that we can afford it out of ongoing revenue, not trying to use surplus funds for some of that.
Okay. Okay. I appreciate that. Delegate Clark, do you have any comments on the issue?
I think everything has been addressed accordingly. I agree with both Delegate Doyle and Delegate Espinosa. Especially what Delegate Doyle just said is that, we're proposing this 5% increase for all state employees, but that also means that we're going to have to line budget that for the next few years to make sure that and it states that it's not just a one time. So, but everything else I agree with, yes.
Okay, thank you for that. The next question is regarding the Crown Act, which has been proposed without success during 2 previous legislative sessions. Will you commit to legislation that prohibits discrimination based on hair texture and, hairstyles? This is open to all 3 of you, so whoever wants to comment.
I will. I've voted for it before.
Okay. All right.
You know, it's as you indicated, Dixie. It has been introduced the last few years. I don't really sense a great deal of support for enacting what I think should be common sense management at the school level. I mean, as far as individuals being able to participate, I don't think they should be discriminated on based on the length of their hair. And I think if someone, my general understanding is that this proposed legislation resulted from a sports, either a coach or a administrator of some sort, basically enacting this type of limitation. And I think that needs to be dealt with at the school level. Again, I see no reason to discriminate about somebody, but I don't necessarily think that it requires legislation for every bad actor that we have out there in a school system. I think the local school board and the local principal ought to address that and make sure that children are not denied an opportunity to participate.
Okay, thank you. Our Secretary of State Warner introduced a bill regarding the integrity of the voter fraud / voter suppression legislation. Do you see this bill being introduced this session?
Well, he's got a different bill this time.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think the bill he has this time is a pretty good one. It's primarily technical cleanups of what we have in the law, and I think it's important to understand. In an election year, you have to be careful with trying to make too many changes in the election law, because when the legislative session finishes in March, it's only a couple of months until the primary. So if you're gonna do a major overhaul of the election law, I think you have to do it in the odd numbered year. So the election administration machinery has an opportunity to adapt to it.
Okay. I think you've already voiced like where you stand on this issue. Delegate Clark, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I think one of the things to keep in mind is that the state of West Virginia had one of the securest elections back in 2020. And I foresee the same thing going on in 2022. Other than a couple of precinct changes due to accessibility and I know that Jefferson County tried to get an additional precinct for early voting, but unfortunately we weren't able to secure that. Same thing in regards to what John's saying is we can't do a major overhaul, on an election year, because 2 months after we're out of session, there you go, we got primaries. But I think our overall election laws that we have in the state of West Virginia are by far some of the best in the country.
Okay, well, I think
Dixie, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
If I may just briefly, I have not actually seen the proposed legislation, but have heard Secretary Warner on local radio describe some of the proposed changes that Delegate Doyle alluded to. And I think the beauty of the proposed legislation, as I understand it, is that it's in direct response, direct consultation with our county clerks around the state, who have looked at, what are some of the tweaks that can be made in order to improve what already is recognized as an outstanding voting process here in the state. So certainly commend Secretary Warner for his leadership in helping make sure that we have open, fair, and transparent elections, and certainly will give his recommended changes serious consideration. And I'll certainly look to our local county clerk, Jackie Shadle, who I think did an outstanding job, implementing our elections here in Jefferson County.
Okay. Well, I think too that terminology, I think, has a lot to do with it. I think in a lot of cases, voter fraud and then voter suppression, they're sort of synonymous and thrown in the same pool. Whereas really, voter fraud is somebody going to the polls and saying they're Dixie done when they're not Dixie done and voting, as opposed to someone who's actually taking ballots out of the ballot boxes and throwing them in the trash, et cetera. So I think this might be something that where the League of Women Voters, as far as from an education process, can get the word out and get some distinction as to the correct terminology.
Well, unfortunately, I think we've seen a little bit of both, Dixie, here in West Virginia. And again, I commend Secretary Warner and his staff for trying to root out some of that activity. Of course, there was a pretty well publicized episode here in West Virginia where I think a postal employee, don't know if he was actually an actual U.S. postal employee, but a contractor perhaps, was engaged in some nefarious activity. And then we've seen some other activity here, and again, commend Secretary Warner for prosecuting or putting in the work to prosecute those. And I think to be very clear, I don't think anyone in the legislature wants to discourage folks from voting. We want to make sure that one person's vote, a legal vote, isn't countered by an illegal vote. And so I think that's why we do have to take the steps necessary in order to make sure that every vote that is a legal ballot should be counted. I don't see an inconsistency there.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments? Okay, then I understand that Rockwell, and we all know about Rockwell, has been in violation of some environmental regulations. One concern has been the aluminum levels being a little higher than set by the Environmental Protection Agency. Another one is the air quality concerns. Do you feel that our current laws are adequate enough to protect our area here from pollution? Do you feel that they're adequate, or do they need to be stronger? And this is open to all three.
Personally feel that the laws that we have in place are plenty sufficient to cover what, I am not aware of, your report that you're stating that Rockwell's in violation of anything. That's something that I've not been privy to. But I think everything as we stand is good for the state. And I know that the state is looking at adding additional industries throughout the state, things such as solar panels, steel plants, additional power plants. So I think everything is in a good state.
I think that West Virginia's laws are not strong enough. And not just with Rockwell, but with plants all over the state, particularly when it comes to groundwater and non-point source into streams. There is stuff being allowed that would not be allowed if our standards were up to those of the EPA. But the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection is operating under rules which are weaker than those of EPA. Now, that's permitted by EPA. EPA puts out a set of recommendations, and states are permitted to be stronger or weaker as they wish. And they can only be weaker down to a certain point. And we've cleared that very low bar. But there are a lot of streams in our state that are polluted that would not be nearly as polluted if the rules governing DEP were equal to those of the EPA.
Okay,
Dixie,
Yeah.
may I ask for a clarification before responding?
sure.
The question was, are you indicating that you are aware that Rockwell has been in violation, or is that the submitted questioner is indicating that
That's the submitted questioner.
okay, all right, well,
Was
okay,
under the impression.
sure. Well, sir, well, I'd be happy to reply to that. I like Delegate Clark, I certainly am not aware of any violations whatsoever, and I think suggesting that that is an established fact is just in error, frankly. Now, as far as the regulations that apply to Rockwell, those are the same regulations that, in the case of water quality, apply to virtually every entity in West Virginia, and certainly those have been enacted over the preceding decades, and so certainly no change there. The air quality regulations that govern facilities like Rockwell and others that have an air permit, those were strengthened. My recollection is that those were strengthened by the EPA back in 2015 with considerable input by the National Sierra Club. Those regulations in turn were adopted by the West Virginia legislature. My recollection, I think those were adopted back in 2017, and they passed the House 98-0. They passed the state Senate 32-0. So I don't think it was very controversial as far as the regulations that were adopted. And certainly whether it's Rockwell or any other entity doing business in West Virginia, I certainly expect, and I think we all have the right to expect, that they should comply with all federal, state, and local regulations. And again, if there's evidence that they're in violation, I think there needs to be evidence shown as opposed to just an assertion made as part of a question.
Right,
Thank
and that's why we have these to clear up issues and to address concerns that our voters are concerned about. Now, one of the things I would like to ask each of you is, what is your top priority for this session of the legislature? Delegate Clark, go ahead and go first.
Sure. So a couple of things that I have a mental health bill that is personal to me that I'll be introducing. The Chapter 18 study that I've been working on all summer. I'll be introducing some legislation that it helps our teachers do their job a little bit better, help our students, hopefully helps our students perform better in school. So those are two of my major priorities that I have, along with a lot of, we have a lot of really, really strong bills that are floating around in our caucus that I'm really happy to see coming out this session. I want to get into details on those until they actually hit committee floors and that kind of stuff. But I'm really excited about this session overall. It's gonna be a busy session, very full. I would not doubt that we surpassed last year's total of what I think it was 280 some bills that we passed. I would not be surprised if we pass more this session.
Okay. Delegate Doyle, what is your primary top priority for this session?
Well, there are two. One is the pay raises for state employees and school employees. And the other is to make sure that we don't do away with the income tax. Because if we do away with the income tax, unless somebody comes up with something unheard of as a replacement, it's just not going to work. I remember, I think it was a week ago, maybe 10 days ago, in Georgia, David Perdue, the former senator and former governor, said that Georgia should do away with its income tax. And the Republican who was chair of the House Budget Committee responded, well, you know what? There's two ways we can do that. One, we can raise the sales tax to 17%. And the other is we can do away with K-12 education. That's the kind of hole in the budget doing away with the income tax will produce. And in particular, we've got a constitutional amendment on the ballot this November, which I believe will pass. And it takes about $500 million away from local government, from counties, cities, and local school boards. And the legislature has in effect committed to those local governments that if this passes, they will be made whole by the legislature. So now the legislature's got to go and find another $500 million somewhere to make these local governments whole. And we're just not going to be able to do it without the income tax.
Okay. Delegate Espinosa, what is your top priority?
So like Delegate Doyle, I certainly have a couple at least. Ever since I first was elected to the legislature back in 2012, began serving on the House Education Committee, I was perplexed by the really lack of a coherent funding model for higher education. And I was particularly concerned that our local institutions, namely Shepherd University and Blue Ridge Community and Technical College, were lowest among their peers in per capita funding. And despite continued questioning as to why our local institutions were funded so low and had been funded so low for really decades, really came to the conclusion that there really wasn't a good answer as to why our institutions were funded lower. And so as chairman of the House Education Committee, a member of the governor's Blue Ribbon Commission on Higher Education, have been pushing for a funding model. And I'm optimistic, I'm very hopeful that because of some of the progress we've made here in recent years, trying to close that gap between funding for some of those on the lower end of the spectrum and some of the higher funded, it looks like as a result of some of the work that we directed the Higher Education Policy Commission and the universities to undertake, am optimistic we'll actually be able to enact legislation that will provide some rationality for how we fund higher education, so that folks that follow in our footsteps won't have to ask that question as to, how are our institutions funded. There'll be an open, transparent way they'll be able to understand, how that funding is allocated. Unlike Delegate Doyle, I certainly support tax reform. I certainly believe it needs to be done responsibly, but we've been running some considerable surpluses here in recent years as a result of us trying to maintain a flatline budget. Certainly have to commend the governor for introducing for the last 3 years, and I understand when we receive his budget here on next Wednesday that it will once again be a flatline budget, trying to control the growth in government spending. I do think it's well past time to provide some needed tax relief for all West Virginians, and certainly would support some modest tax reform to provide just that.
Okay, thank you.
If I could add, first of all, Paul's exactly right about the higher education funding model. I think the plan that we've come up with is a good one, and I do think it has a good chance of passing. Secondly, I didn't say I was opposed to tax reform. I actually think the passage of the constitutional amendment that is on the ballot in November, and again, I expect it to pass, I think that will constitute tax reform. We have to be careful when we say tax reform that we don't mean so much tax reduction that we can't pay our bills.
Right. Right. Well, and this is kind of a personal question in that I am a senior citizen. And with everything going up, I mean, with minimum wage being $13 an hour, and yet there doesn't, the COLA or cost of living increase for seniors doesn't even, come close to that. So, and again, you guys are on a state level, and the COLA again comes from the national level. So can you make any comments about that, about how you or how the state of West Virginia is looking after its senior citizens?
I'm a little confused about how you explain that. The COLA you're talking about, is that Social Security?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, yeah, and of course the state has nothing to do with that.
Right, right.
There has been in the past, I've ever since I got in the legislature in 1982, there have been advocates among retired state employees that they should have a COLA. I've always opposed it. We do periodically go through and revise the standards for state pensions. And I do think that we've been able to keep up fairly well with that. But that's the only role that the state government would have, in my view, in terms of pensions, because we have nothing to do with the pensions of people who have not worked for state government.
Right. Again, it's one of those topics, that you see out there on Facebook where people who've worked years and years and years and put into the Social Security are not even, what they're getting. But again, I won't go off on that. That's kind of a tangent there. Is there anything?
Dixie?
Yes.
Dixie, I will respond just to the other part of your question. Really was pleased to support legislation here. I think it wasn't this last year, but I think it was perhaps the year before that did set West Virginia on the path. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think this might be the third year of a 3-year program it's either the second or third year to eliminate the state income tax on Social Security benefits. And that's something that certainly have advocated, really throughout my tenure in the legislature. And I think that goes a long way. I think there is a means test within that legislation we passed, but it does provide relief, particularly for those folks on the lower income end of the scale. So certainly was pleased to support that.
And definitely, appreciate that input. Is there anything else that the three of you would like to share with our audience about what you're, what you're planning to do, or the things that are, that you can speak about, as far as you've already shared with us some of your top priorities, but is there something in particular that we should know that hasn't been mentioned, as far as what's on the legislative floor?
Well, I'll certainly be happy to share just a few other priorities that I'll plan to work on this legislative session. In recent years, last year in particular, was very pleased to champion licensure reform to try to lower the barriers to entry for those folks that do want to enter the workforce. Unfortunately, West Virginia, I think, still has the distinction of having the lowest workforce participation rate in the country, and that's based on those eligible workers that are of working age. Again, not a distinction that we're proud of, but was very pleased to sponsor legislation last session to try to make more sense out of our licensure laws, just to make sure that we don't have really high barriers to entry that are much more significant than those in our surrounding states. So was very proud to champion that legislation, and would anticipate enacting some additional legislation just to make sure, again, that those folks that are able to enter the workforce are doing so, and that we're providing assistance to those folks that truly need it. We've already talked about, of course, the role that we have in granting spending authority, and so certainly would anticipate that we'll be looking very carefully at the remaining CARES and ARPA funds, predominantly the ARPA funds. Delegate John Hardy, who co-chairs our Select Committee on Infrastructure, certainly has been doing quite a bit with his committee to look at ways we can just make sure that the ARPA dollars and other federal dollars that we have coming to West Virginia, that we're spending in those in a way that will help to transform West Virginia. And I'm pleased to report, Dixie and others on the call, that our development office reports that West Virginia, the reforms that we've made here in recent years are attracting attention by significant job creators, and certainly appreciate the recognition by those that are considering locating a business or expanding a business, that they're increasingly looking at West Virginia because of some of the legal, regulatory, and hopefully tax reforms that we'll enact here in West Virginia. I think those are, again, some of the key items that I'll be working on this legislative session.
Okay.
Actually, I thought of another one.
Okay.
Thank you. And I've thought about this for over a year. The Department of Environmental Protection
Mhm.
has statutory limits on how high fines can be when there are companies that break the law. And it was brought home to me a year or so ago with a couple of the pipeline companies. And to give you an example, the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which is going through West Virginia and Virginia, there were two violations that DEP found in West Virginia, and they fined Mountain Valley, I think, $300,000 in one case, and about $260,000 in another case, if I recall the numbers correctly. Very similar types of offenses in Virginia, and the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, that's what they call it, fined Mountain Valley Pipeline over $3 million. Now, DEP is seriously understaffed, particularly when it comes to inspectors. And that's another reason that some folks are getting away with violating the law and nobody's picking it up. I think if DEP were permitted statutorily to increase the fines on what are effectively lawbreakers by considerable, they would be able to get enough money to build up the staff that they could keep track of these violations and thereby preventing a lot of them.
Okay.
And Dixie,
Yes,
to follow
go
up
ahead,
on,
Delegate Clark. Yes.
yeah, just to follow up on a couple of points. One of the things that we always seem to miss, especially up here in the Eastern Panhandle, is the importance of coal for the state of West Virginia, but also, myself, Delegate Espinosa, Delegate Doyle, and all the other Eastern Panhandle folks, our importance of making sure that we're educating the rest of the state on the importance of West Virginia breeders in the Eastern Panhandle to the state and the revenue that they bring in. So one of the other projects that I am going to be working on is trying to make sure that our West Virginia breeders, our local breeders here, are protected, and the horse racing industry continues. So I've been speaking with a lot of the southern delegates and trying to work out some adjustments to to help our breeders and make sure that they stay whole.
Okay, and
And
definitely.
Wayne's right about that.
Very much.
A big problem is the Charleston Gazette Mail, which I've had many conversations with them trying to explain to them that it's not taxpayers' money that's going into the purse fund and the breeders fund. They think it is. So anyway.
Okay. Well, I appreciate your input. At this point in time, we will go ahead and take questions from our audience. If you would submit those through the chat, then we will go on with that. Okay, someone mentioned that the air quality engendered by rock will choke racehorses. I'm not familiar with anything like that. Delegate Clark, I mean, you mentioned our breeders. Has anyone ever said anything about that?
No.
Okay. I'm just waiting here to see if there are any other questions that would like to be submitted by our audience. And
Dixie, while we're waiting for another question, Delegate Clark, in stressing the importance of the horse racing industry to Jefferson County and to really our state as a whole, brought up the subject of energy. And I'll just remind folks that are on this call that over the last couple years, and I think during this last legislation in particular, the legislature did enact legislation. It might have been last year that we had a key piece of legislation that does make it a bit easier for our power companies to deploy renewable energies and alternative energies, particularly solar. And I think that's in a direct response to certain job creators that have made it very clear that in order for them to seriously consider locating in West Virginia, they want to have greener energy. And while we certainly, or at least I certainly, and I think Delegate Clark's indicated, certainly recognizes the importance of coal and natural gas as base in satisfying the base load energy needs of West Virginia and our country, I think we have to continue to do all that we can to foster additional green energy in West Virginia, so that those entities that do wish to use greener energy have that option. And again, I was happy to sponsor that legislation that was enacted here over it's either the last year or the year before, and certainly will continue to look at legislation that will diversify our energy grid, so that we can represent to those considering locating to West Virginia that we can provide green energy.
Okay, and we definitely appreciate that. Delegate Clark, can you speak a little bit more about the legislation regarding mental health?
Yeah, so currently right now in our school system, we have a bill that helps to identify and has the teachers go through training for suicide prevention. But basically what it is a 3-hour seminar before school starts of just a couple of trigger points and things like that. My bill that we're working on goes beyond that. It talks about identifying triggers, identifying kids that are in a depressed state to begin with. It identifies, it helps the teachers identify eating disorders, help coaches to identify eating disorders. So this is going to be a training that's going to be throughout all of our education system, even our service personnel, to help them identify kids in an early stage, and so that they can get the support they need. We all know that the situation with COVID and the isolation of our kids, and how manipulated they were of on the social media world, has put a massive a negative effect on the kids and their performance, along with cyberbullying and all the other stuff that is going on. So this bill is going to address a majority of those issues. And from a parent of 15-year-old twins, I've seen this it happen in front of my eyes. So I'm very passionate about this. Ann Allison, who is my bill drafter that's been working on this since all the way back in August, has been just absolutely phenomenal in sitting down with meetings with the school board, with meetings with different agencies throughout the country, to put together a very impressive bill that's going to help kids in the future. So that gives you a roundabout of it. So without me starting to get a little emotional.
Okay, and we definitely value and support you on this particular issue. I was reading an article today that there seems to be a shortage of the vaccines getting into West Virginia. Does that go back to the supply chain issue, or do you have any insight or input on why we're not getting the vaccines?
I don't know if it has to do with the supply chain. I don't know if it has to do with manufacturing. I know one of my employees today was scheduled to get his booster shot, and he got to CVS and they said, sorry, we don't have any. We're not going to have any for a couple of weeks. I know that home tests and all that stuff. I don't think it's a state issue. I think you need to look a little bit further east, from where we're located at, and I think that's where your issue is.
Okay, all right.
I certainly would like to, Dixie, I would like to commend General Hoyer, who heads up our Joint Interagency Task Force, of course, former Adjutant General for the West Virginia National Guard, who heads up our response effort. And I think he and his team are doing just a tremendous effort to work through what I think all of us would agree is just a very, very challenging time. Now, Not trying to promote one pharmacy over another, but I just heard anecdotally just here over the Christmas holidays that a family friend walked into Walmart and got their choice of a vaccination right there. There was no
Right.
wait, no sign up or anything. So just because one pharmacy may be experiencing a delay, don't assume that others don't have it, because again, this individual indicated walked in, had his choice of Pfizer, Moderna, or the Johnson and Johnson. So I think it's available. I think folks have got to do a little bit of homework, and certainly we encourage all those on the advice of their doctors to certainly be vaccinated and take advantage of the vaccination. I think while I think it's increasingly being shown that it won't necessarily prevent an individual from contracting COVID, evidence seems to be there that it'll decrease the symptoms associated with COVID. So certainly would encourage folks to seriously consider that.
Okay. At this point, it doesn't look like there's any additional questions coming in. I do personally want to thank, you, Delegate Espinosa, Delegate Clark, and John Doyle, Delegate Doyle, for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you attend these, and we can't wait for the wrap-up meeting to find out exactly what you've accomplished and what we can look forward to. At this point in time, I'm going to turn the meeting over to Effie Callis.
Dixie, if I may just say on behalf of the entire delegation, would encourage folks to reach out to us during the session. If you see legislation that we're working on, certainly welcome your perspective. The Capitol will be open for visitors. So if you have the opportunity, would like to come down and visit the Capitol, certainly reach out. Always happy to meet with folks here, particularly from the Eastern Panhandle.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, Effie.
Thank you for that invitation, Delegate Espinosa. Thank you to all of the delegates who attended this evening. We really appreciate this. It is a service to the Jefferson County, particularly citizens. As I said earlier, this is recorded, we put it up on our website, and we promote it. So it is, a way not only for people who can watch tonight, but we keep promoting it so people come, and we do keep stats on that. We have seen that people do on their own at other times go back and look. So, just know that we do everything we can to make sure that your message gets out to the greater public. For everyone who dialed in a little late, just wanted to let you know that our legislative wrap-up meeting has not yet been scheduled. Please check our website and our Facebook. Once that gets scheduled, we'll put those dates right up. It'll be sometime in March after a legislative session. Also want to invite you to take a look at our website. We have posted a workshop that was recorded by the Huntington area League of Women Voters on how to run for public office. So if anyone out there is thinking about maybe running for office, I know that Secretary Warner has already posted the filing dates. And so you might want to check out the Secretary of State's website if you're thinking of running, to make sure that you are in compliance with the filing dates, and then watch that video and you'll be further ahead. I think that we have done great on time at 7:55. I want to thank Dixie for acting as moderator again. I want to thank Susan Pipes for acting as our behind the scene person taking care of everything. And without further ado, I'll just say good night and thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think the video has stopped, I think. She keeps recording.